Hello everyone, welcome back to another Strategoy video. Ryan here with the culmination, I guess you could say, of our Idoneth Deepkin coverage for a while. We started last week with the index review with Jonas and myself, and that was a broader kind of overview of everything with a little bit of deep dive on some of the war scrolls. But then I set out to cover all of the war scrolls one by one in 3 different groups, starting with monsters and getting all the way down to infantry today. And then after this, we'll be done with Idoneth for a while. I think our next 2 videos should be a video from Jonas, where he covered the Idoneth River Blades in Lumineth, and then right after that, a couple days later, we'll have in a sort of interview, but index review I did with Hugo over the about the Tzeentch index, which should be lovely. So I hope you guys are looking forward to those. And then whether or not we'll do some of these War Scroll coverages of Tzeentch units afterwards remains to be determined. But that's definitely the next few videos that we've got coming up. And who knows what we'll do after that. Let us know down in the comments if you have any requests, by the way. Anyway, thank you so much for all the positive responses to all of the Idoneth stuff. Even though we haven't been reaching our kind of normal benchmark for viewership, the people that have been watching it seem to be very positive. So I really, really, really appreciate that. And we even got a donation on one of the videos, which is super sweet of you guys. So thank you so much for everything you're doing. Keep boosting the signal. Join us in the Discord and down below in the comments. And let's just get on with it. Okay, so as I mentioned, we started with monsters, which of course would be the Leviathan plus the 2 Eidolons. Then we moved on to the cavalry, which would be the 2 kings, eels, sharks, and both sorts of eels, and then the sharks. That's it. And now today we're covering basically everything else with a little bonus at the end. I'm curious if you guys can guess what the bonus is, but we'll be covering all of the infantry Idoneth models and units, starting with the heroes and then working our way down to the 2 Namarti units. So without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so as I've laid out before, and Jonas and Siegfried did for their coverage of the Lumineth War Scrolls, we're going to be using a rough rating system of 5 stars per War Scroll. Keep in mind, it's early days and opinions might change. I've only gotten 8 games in thus far with the Idoneth stuff, and only Idoneth, which is why I'm starting here, really. So my opinion might change, but these are my best guesses. Fortunately, I couldn't find a single 1-star unit in the whole army, so that's saying something, I think. But anyway, the different ratings are going to be 1 star is best to avoid, 2 stars is a sub-optimal pick, 3 stars decent in certain situations, 4 stars great in most situations, and 5 stars wouldn't hurt to bring it in every list. I would even go so far as to say 3 stars could be great in certain situations, just that it's more situational. But okay, let's get started. So I'm going to start with Lotann himself, our only unique foot hero now, and one of only 2 unique heroes with Volturnos by his side. He's not a War Master, so Volturnos is our only War Master, but like a War Master, he can take any Idoneth Deepkin in his regiment, which is definitely a nice ability. He's also one of our italics heroes, which means he can be taken 0 to 1, but of course you can only take 1 of him anyway because he's unique, by literally all of our heroes except for the Thrallmaster, which we'll be covering in a bit. He's 110 points, and if we take a look at his weapon wheel, it's going to be very similar for a lot of these heroes. 5 health, 6-inch move, 5 up save, no ward save, control 2. Pretty standard. He's got 2 main abilities in addition to being Isharon, which is most of our heroes for today. If we go from left to right there, the passive Catalog of Souls is adding 3 to the control scores of friendly Idoneth Deepkin units while they're wholly within 12 inches of this unit. So a couple points there. 1, it does impact him. So he goes from control 2 up to control 5 by default. He just is always control 5. They could have obviously made it control 5 and then said that he doesn't get it's for only other Idoneth Deepkin units, but this is what they chose to go with. A second point, just for those of you out there that aren't 100% up to date with what control score is all about, this is obviously how many bodies you count as on objectives. The thing is, control score and control characteristic are 2 different things, and unfortunately in the control part of the weapon or the stats wheel up above, it doesn't specify which one it is. It's implied that it's control characteristic if you were to look at a more fleshed out version of the rule in the core rules. So a control score, however, is this, say you have a unit that consists of more than one model. It's the sum of all of the models in that unit's control scores, control characteristics, and then adding or subtracting any debuffs that might be in play. So if he was affecting a unit of 3 eels, each with control score or control characteristic 1, and say one of them is a standard bearer, giving it another one, so they'd count as 3 in total on that objective, plus 1 for the standard bearer, and then plus an additional 3 with Lotann standing around them, so that they're wholly within 12 inches of him, which would push us all the way up to 7, which is pretty great for low drop, or not low drop, but low body count units, such as eels, or even sharks. Sharks would count as, I think they're base 2, so that would push them up to 5, which is pretty good for making you able to contest some objectives with an elite army. It's an ability that I think has been underestimated thus far in some of the coverage I've seen, people talking about this stuff, or just chat online. But anyway, so yeah, that's how that works. And then the Fount of Willpower passive ability is also amazing. Also a wholly within 12-inch bubble is adding +1 to casting rolls for friendly Isheron units that are wholly within. Right? Now, unfortunately, he's not a caster, but you have 2 great foot hero casters in the Tidecaster and Soulscryer that are both getting this buff, and they're Isheron. Plus, if you're in the Isheron Council, Lotann does count as one of the Isheron heroes that can be standing within combat range of another Isheron hero to give them the bonuses to casting, which means in Isheron Council, Lotann is more or less, if he's standing close by enough, giving +2 to casting rolls for those units. And that's just amazing. Plus, you could be standing next to a place of power and activate that and get up to +3, which is pretty solid. For most of these units, I'm not really going to be talking about their power, their melee output, because it's more or less negligible. He's not even fighting with his own weapon. It's a companion weapon, which is a point that I made below, but I'll get to that in a second. With 8 attacks, 4s and 4s, 1 rend, 1 damage, which if you see 4s and 4s in a profile, you can basically take the multiplied result of the attacks times the damage, so in this case 8, and just divide it straight by 4 to know what it's doing before you calculate for rend. So before we take into rend, he's doing on average 2 wounds. That's it. So anyway, it's not really anything to write home about. So let's talk about in the notes column. I said he's essentially our banner/totem. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of the big banner bearers that we've seen, like Stormcast and other armies, tend to have a control score of 5 just built in. And of course, he basically has that himself. And then they might have some kind of ability that also boosts the control scores of other units around them. So that's basically what he's doing, despite the fact that he doesn't actually have a banner. And of course, because he's unique, unlike some of those armies, we can't take multiple copies of him. So you just get 1 Lotann. He boosts the performance of the Tidecaster and Soulscryer, which is fantastic. And of course, implicitly, he's also raising their control scores. If they're standing within one bubble, they're in the other one too. So that's just really nice. He's especially good in Isheron Council, which I mentioned is helping him count as one of the Isheron units you have to stand within combat range of to get the buffs. And of course, is further boosting those casting rolls for those units you probably are also bringing along that are also Isheron. As an italics hero, meaning he can be taken in another hero's regiment, he can lower your drops while still having him. So you could functionally get up to take what would otherwise be a 6-drop list and make it 5, so therefore no auxiliaries, by having 5 heroes and then Lotann, or some amount lower than that. In contrast to that idea is that instead of being an italics hero, he could also be the regiment's leader himself, which, as I mentioned before, he can take all Idoneth Deepkin units, and he's the only foot hero that can do that. Which means that if you want to do basically an all foot hero list, but want to take like a Leviathan, or want to take a Alopex or Eels, this is the way you're going to get access to that without having to dip into the Kings or Eidolons, which is good to know for list writing. And then my last point was, warning, his melee is only a companion weapon, which means it's not that it's particularly worth buffing anyway, but it's only benefiting from things that say companion weapons, or well, yeah, things that say companion weapons. So that would be all-out attack. And then let me double-check Akalian Beastmasters, because he doesn't have the Akalian keyword, so I'm assuming, even though this is a companion, he's not benefiting from it. Let me double-check that real quick. Yeah, so he's not Akalian, so it's not benefiting. So the only way I know of that he gets that buff to his output is if you alt attack him, and I can tell you right now that's not worth it. That boosts the output to 2.67 at one rend. So I wouldn't go all in on that. Overall, I gave Lotann a 3-star rating. I actually think he's kind of a 4-star unit in the right list, but I think I'm kind of defining 3-star as being great in particular lists. And if you're not running Isheron or not worried about your control scores, I don't know that you really need him. Plus, he does take up a slot, but at 110 points, I think he's quite reasonable. And the model is really cool. So I'm a fan, but I know he's not for every list. Okay. Moving on to the Tidecaster, our more expensive of the two casters. Like the rest of the Isheron heroes, can take 0-1 Lotann, as I mentioned, and then can take any Namarti. So that would just be Thralls and Reavers. So your choices are pretty restricted when you take these heroes, and they have to be in separate regiments, which means they're raising your drops implicitly. That said, I actually feel like Idoneth is okay with having relatively high drops compared to some other armies because of how catty we want to play from the beginning, and we're not really trying to engage much in the first round anyway. So what is the Tidecaster doing? Same weapon wheel as Lotann, Wizard 1, and Isheron. The melee weapons are negligible. I'll go ahead and talk about it now. Her own weapon is 3 attacks, 3s, 4s, minus 1, D3, which comes out to 2.00 with 1 rend, so basically the same equation as Lotann for just that weapon. But then the companion weapon, which I'm just now seeing is an Ether Shark, that's pretty cool, is 2 attacks at 4s, 4s, no rend 1, which, again, if you have 4s and 4s, you can just divide by 4. So that's coming out to 0.50 at no rend. So not really anything to write home about. Now, what you really are taking the Tidecaster for is 2 things. One, she's a caster, very important, and then once per turn army, your hero phase, so this is 5 turns per game, you make an Isheron ritual roll of a d6. On a 3-up, this is on a d6, pick one of the following effects to apply to the start of your next turn. So it's modular. You have 3. Creeping Mist. Friendly Idoneth Deepkin units cannot be targeted by shooting attacks, but yes, magic or other things, unless the attacking model is within 12. This is so powerful in the right matchups because, like, say it's KO or another big ranged shooting army that's got a lot of its output sunk in range shots that don't really want to get within 12 inches. This is basically turning off that army's output, and it's amazing. And it applies to all Idoneth Deepkin units, not just smaller units or guarded heroes or whatever. So it's basically giving guarded hero for infantry heroes to your whole army, which is as close as we get to Forgotten Nightmares. For those that don't know, in the 3rd edition book, like in the 2nd edition book, or whatever, the 1st edition book that was used in 2nd edition, we had Forgotten Nightmares where you had to choose the closest, enemy shooting units had to target the closest unit when fighting against Idoneth. That was also in the 3rd edition book, and now is gone. But then in the 3rd edition book, they also added a ritual roll, a ritual, which you just got to pick at the beginning of the game, which, if you had an Isheron model in your army, and you could pick 2 if you had the Tidecaster. So you picked a ritual to go along with it, and the one for low tide was this ability, basically. But it was only applicable for the first battle round in 5th, with assuming tides were normal. Now it's just, as long as it goes off on a 3-up, you can have it every turn, which is really powerful. We'll talk about how you can boost that in a second. But let's go on to Surging Stream. This is adding +1 to run and charge rolls for friendly Idoneth Deepkin units. I think this is kind of the default choice in most matchups, because there are going to be some opponents you play against that don't really need, you don't really need to do the shooting thing. So adding 1 to run and charge rolls is just making sure that you get those charges off when you need to. And consider in battle round 2, you're getting run and charge. So you're basically getting +2 to your move, assuming you want to charge. Which is really nice. It's also good for the Reavers, just to make sure that they can run and shoot, which they always have, and they're getting +1 to run on that. It's also good for deep strikes. Keep in mind, our normal deep strike that we have from the 1 battle regiment that can go into the Either Sea at the beginning of the game is outside of 9. So this is making it functionally outside of 8 if you're trying to hit that charge that turn that you come in. And the Soulscryer is outside 7, which we'll talk about shortly, and that this would make it outside, well, essentially a 6-inch charge, which is fantastic. I really think this ability is strong. And then the last one, which is probably just more fluffy, each time an enemy unit uses a retreat ability after the effect of that ability has been resolved, inflict D3 mortal damage. This has 2 kind of impacts, or maybe 3. Let's say that you're doing it against a normal army that suffers retreat damage no matter what when they retreat, then that's going from 1d3 mortal damage to 2d3. And honestly, that might be enough for them to say, screw it, I'm not going to do it, on like especially a hero that is just going to be sniped out by doing that. So you go engage with that hero and say, I dare you to retreat. That's maybe some tech there. The second situation is armies that don't take damage when they retreat, like Idoneth in the 4th battle round when they can retreat and shoot, retreat and charge, and don't take damage doing it, or the Eidolon of the Storm in general. Then this is making sure that at least they do have to weigh that decision by taking D3 mortal damage regardless. And then the last situation is really more of just kind of what I already alluded to, which is to say some armies are going to say, well, this ability isn't actually going to do any damage. What it's going to do is make them like choose not to retreat, which has some tactical value for you too, because it's not only keeping their units safe, or maybe say they've got retreat and charge, keeping them locked in combat so they don't get like a charge bonus, but maybe also importantly, in many cases, is it's a deterrent to keep them from going and trying to grab another objective, especially for cav units that have quite a bit of movement when they retreat. So there is some tech there. I think there are going to be turns and matchups where you're not worried about the shooting, and then turns where you don't really need the +1 to run and charge yourself. So then this becomes the option. And considering it's a free ability, it's very valuable, I think. Problem is, because it's once per turn army, you can't take 2 Tidecasters and make this go off. You can't even trigger it twice in case it doesn't go off the first time. The only reason you'd want to take 2 Tidecasters, especially considering you've got a cheaper caster in the Soulscryer, is that you, if one of them dies, if you really, really need this ability, maybe you have a second one just in case, so that you can keep trying to trigger it. But personally, I don't think that's worth it. So let's go through my notes here. I said, although it's more expensive than the Soulscryer at Wizard 1, so a 1 caster, her rituals make her quite potent, especially in Isheron Council. So what do I mean by that? Well, in Isheron Council, as I already described with Lotann talking about adding +1 to cast, one of the other buffs you get when you are standing within combat range, so 3 inches, of another Isheron hero, is you get +1 on your Isheron ritual rolls, which means it goes from a pretty unreliable 3-up to a much better 2-up, really. And that consistency might be enough to convince someone, especially in conjunction with the +1 to cast for a number of your casters, to actually consider the Isheron Council instead of Soul Raid Ambushers. But I still think Soul Raid Ambushers is worth trading off that +1. Now, I said in my next point that you probably only need 1 Tidecaster, specifically for the very diminished added value of bringing a second. But in general, having a Tidecaster is also nice because it's just another teleport platform. So say you have 1 Soulscryer, 1 Tidecaster, and then say you want to go really heavy in Magic and you've got an Eidolon of the Sea, then you've got 3 different teleport platforms. Or maybe you want 2 Soulscryers, which I could totally see. It's just because we have an unlimited teleport spell, you need to have different casters to cast that. And even though the Tidecaster is more expensive than a Soulscryer, she does bring added value with this ritual and is in fact cheaper than taking 1 Eidolon of the Sea. Because Eidolon of the Sea is 350 points, and 1 Tidecaster and 1 Soulscryer are at, 270 points. So you're saving some, 80 points worth of stuff to get the same number of casts, albeit not at +1, but if you were in Isheron Council, they would get it back by standing near each other. And then you've got 2 teleport platforms instead of 1, which I do think has some value. And lastly, she can get up to +2 or +3 to cast if you're standing around a place of power. So pretty nice. Anyway, I gave the Tidecaster a 5 stars. At least as taking 1 of. I don't think you have to take a Tidecaster in a list, and maybe you won't be able to fit it in your points, but I think there's so many matchups where the utility of the ritual roll is so strong, and especially if you're going Isheron Council, I don't see why you wouldn't, because she's also getting the +1 to cast if she's getting the +1 ritual roll. So you're getting double value here. Okay, let's move on. To the Soulscryer, another 5-star unit. I'm just going to throw it out there. I think this is the MVP of techie Idoneth list writing for multiple reasons. Let's start with, like I mentioned a couple times already, it's 120 points for a 1-caster that has access to a teleport spell. Just fantastic. And considering, of course, that the endless spells are so strong right now, manifestations, you also want a caster. This guy used to be a priest, and instead of like giving us a prayer lore, a prayer scripture, they just decided, hey, let's go give him the wizard keyword. And so now we've got an even cheaper wizard. He, as a hero, can take the same options that the other ones did, which is 0 to 1 Lotann, plus any Namarti units, so Thralls and Reavers. His weapon wheel looks identical, so I'm not going to cover it. And he's Isharon. One thing that he does have that's unique is a ranged weapon that's actually shooting combat, which is our only unit, if I'm not mistaken, that has shooting combat in Idoneth. That said, unfortunately, it's pretty bad. At 8 attacks at 5s and 5s, let's do the math on that real quick. That comes out to roughly 8/9 of a wound that goes through on average before you take into account the rend. So it's not doing a whole lot. I don't even know why they put it on him, honestly, just because the model has it, I guess. I would personally rather it be half as many attacks in 4s and 4s or something like that, or whatever, 4s and 5s, I don't know. But at 5s and 5s, you waste more time throwing these dice than you do, you'd be almost better off just not rolling them. His melee profile is coming out to pretty much the same thing as what the Tidecaster had without her companion. Anyway, the real reason you're taking him is not only because he's a 1-caster, but the next 2 abilities. Let's look at the second one first. So this is one that would discourage you from taking redundancy because it is once per turn army, your hero phase. But that said, I've rarely had it eligible thing to do because you have to target an enemy hero within 18 inches. But if you set it up right, it could have some use. But what you're doing is you're on a 3-up. You're adding 1 to wound rolls for combat attacks made by friendly Idoneth Deepkin units that target that hero for the rest of the turn. So not even until your following hero phase. So, it's got limited utility. It's mainly leaning into a combat build either with Thralls or maybe Eels or something. +1 to wound is great. It's kind of like a light version of what the Eidolon of the Storm is bringing. And considering that the Soulscryer has so much added value, it's just... why not? But I don't know that it's the main reason you're taking him. It's just kind of some coating on top. The real reason you're taking him is your movement phase, the ability above, Finder of Ways. Pick a friendly Idoneth Deepkin unit that is traveling the Either Sea to be the target. Set up the target wholly within 12 inches of this unit and more than 7 inches from all enemy units. Well, what's going on here? So first off, what does it mean to be traveling the Either Sea? Well, with our battle traits, you can put for free 1 whole regiment, but you have to put the whole regiment, you can't split it up, into the Either Sea, which is basically in reserve. And they have to come down on the table by the end of turn 3. So in one of your movement phases, you'd have to bring them down. Normally, they have to come in wholly within 9 inches of a board edge and then outside of 9 of enemy units. They don't have to come down around each other, by the way. Now, what the Soulscryer is doing here is he's saying, well, screw the board edge. You can come in wholly one of the units because this is an ability you have to activate, and we know that units can only activate their ability once. So you pick a friendly unit that is traveling to Either Sea, so only one of the however many units are in the reserve right now per turn, and you set them up wholly within 12 inches of this model, and then outside of 7 from enemy units. So it's yes, it's restricted to being around him, but hopefully you've set him up in a place where it's actually more advantageous than 9 inches, wholly than 9 of board edge somewhere. Which, by the way, wholly than 9 inches of board edge is not bad, but this is definitely more flexible and gives you some strategic value. Also, considering he's basically bringing them in 2 inches closer if you want it, which is great for, say, a block of Reavers that want to shoot with only 12-inch range and we're worried about an opponent redeploying. Now to get outside of the range, they have to have a higher redeploy roll to avoid being shot. Or for your charges, obviously, especially if you can set them your target combat unit that wants to go in and charge just outside of 7 of 2 different units. He can only redeploy with one of them, your opponent, and then you're pretty guaranteed to get that charge, especially if the Tidecaster's got +1 to charge. So then you're looking at a 6-inch charge, which is just fantastic. Further, some tech that you can do with this guy is you can teleport him. he can either teleport himself or someone else can teleport him and send him somewhere else so that his holier than 12-inch bubble and outside of 7 from enemy units best sets you up for exactly what I just said. Pretty amazing tech. And finally, in Soul Raid Ambushers, what's going on here is, in addition to the regiment that could have gone into the Either Sea in reserve at the beginning of the game in the deployment phase, at the end of each of your turns, you can pick one of your friendly units that's holier than 3 inches of a terrain piece, and that includes faction terrain, or so including your 2 boats if you split them up. So you've got lots of potential options with a split-up boat giving you at least 10 pieces on the battlefield. They get to go back into the Either Sea, and unlike the normal reserve coming out of reserve rules, those units, based off of what happens in the core rules, as long as they weren't put in the reserve in the deployment phase, they can come down whenever you like later in the game, including turns 4 and 5, which has so much tactical value. And what you do is you can basically like take a small unit of eels or whatever you like, have them charge in, go fight, power through, go fly over, either steal an objective or be next to a terrain piece, then put them back in the sky, the sea, and then next turn the Soulscryer can go ahead and put them exactly where he wants them to be, which is so strong. Now granted, you can only do it once per turn with the Soulscryer, but that's per Soulscryer. It doesn't say once per turn army, it's just because it's an ability he uses on his war scroll, you can only activate it once. So what's that doing? You bring 2 Soulscryers, which is great value for a wizard, and plus it's giving you extra deep strike potential for these units. And then you've got plenty of redundancy if you need it, but you can also bring in 2 on 1 turn outside of 7 and holier than 12 of each of those Soulscryers. So strong, and considering how strong magic is, especially with endless spells, and all the different combos we can do right now, I think this has so much added value. Especially considering in Soul Raid Ambushers, sometimes you want to put your general or any of his regiment members outside of reach from the threats that are on the table to deny that battle tactic, right? It's just so strong. Take a giant block of 20 Reavers that was in your general's regiment and has priority target. They can go shoot. You can teleport them away so they're holier than 3 inches. Like this would be your opponent's covering what magical intervention. You teleport them away. So that they're holier than 3 inches of terrain, and then they're safe from not getting shot, and then maybe you could put them in the sky. There's all kinds of cool tricks you can do. I think this guy's just absolutely essential. So I'll go through the notes really quick, but I basically made all the points. He's extremely efficient for his points, both as a wizard and for all the tech that I've just described. He's a wizard 1 with a better deep strike option, pairs well into Ishran Council, so you can get +1 to cast. And of course, he's also counting as an Ishran model to be giving those buffs out to the other Ishran heroes. He's a must-take in Soul Raid Ambushers. I swear by that. He even has value as taking 2 or more of them for the reasons I've already outlined. And his once per turn +1 to wound versus a hero is something, but it's kind of situational. 5 stars all the way. Love this guy. Okay, moving on to the Soulrender. 140 points for the same set of regiment options that the other guys have. He does have a better weapon wheel in the sense that he's got a 3-up save instead of a 5. He's not a wizard, so already I'm starting to question whether he's actually worth those points. He's kind of positioned as one of our melee guys for the foot heroes, but that's kind of questionable. If you look at his 4 attacks, 3s, 4s, 1 rend, 2 damage, we're looking at 2.67 at rend 1, which is my last point on the notes down there. It's not really all that great. And then his Raker Darts companion attack is coming out to 0.75 at 1 rend. So, not really adding a whole lot. So if you add those together, I guess, because they have the same rend, that's actually pretty easy. We're looking at 3.42 at 1 rend. It's not really that impressive, but it's a little better than your other heroes that are similar. One of his buffs, of course, is he's an Ishran hero, so he does count for triggering those abilities for those other heroes, as we mentioned before. There are 2 abilities that he's got. One is once per battle, the red one on the right, any combat phase. You pick an enemy hero in combat, so within 3 inches of this guy, and this would be before they actually have to fight. you roll 2d6, and if the roll exceeds, not matches, the target's health characteristic, it is automatically destroyed. Now, this is one of the things that kind of makes him a melee hero, and the cool thing is it's 2d6, which functionally means that you could snipe a hero of 11 wounds, 11 health characteristic or lower, which is pretty impressive. Now, I did the math on this ability. I didn't put it on screen, but the average foot hero you'll be targeting would have 5 wounds, and obviously, we're talking about rolling 6 or higher on 2d6, which is above average, by the way. And once you take into account the probability and the total health characteristic, we're looking at him doing essentially 3.61 mortal damage once you factor those two things, probability and how much it would do. And that's actually the best overall expected value that he has is against a wounds characteristic of 5. But of course, that's the most common that you're going to see in a foot hero. The chance that it goes off on 11 health hero is a 1 out of 36, so I wouldn't plan on it. But in a sort of Hail Mary, I guess you could say, well, it's once per battle. He's probably going to die now. Why not just blow this and see what happens? And, of course, that would have a huge impact on the following combat phase if you got it off. Probably not against a foot hero, a regular 5 wound, 5 health foot hero, but it's something. It's more just icing on the cake. The real reason you're taking this guy, if you do, is the end of any turn ability, so that would be your opponent's turn. You can pick as well as yours. You can pick up to 3 different friendly Namarti units, that would be just Reavers and Thralls, wholly then 12. That's actually a really generous bubble. You cannot pick the same unit to be the target of this ability more than once per turn, and I'm pretty sure that means if you take 2 of these guys, it still counts as this ability, Lure Light, even though it's not this guy using this ability. Like, it's not like the abilities become new instances. Like, Isheron Soulrender 1's Lure Light is different than Isheron Soulrender 2's Lure Light. I think it just means the Lure Light ability. They can't be targeted by it more than once per turn, but it's still strong. You make a D3 roll on a D3 2-up, so on a 3-up on a D6, you return a number of slain models to the target unit equal to the roll, which is on average 1 2/3 models back. Granted, it would be either 2 or 3, but that's also accounting for the possibility that you just fail the roll. Now, in Isheron Council, which I'll get to in the notes, I guess, but if he's standing around an Isheron hero, and of course he's also counting as an Isheron hero for them, then it's adding +1 to the roll, and the roll is on a D3. I've gotten confirmation that as it currently stands, the way D3s work, this is not saying it converts to a 2 on a D6, because it wouldn't change the outcome. It's converting it to a 1 on a D3. So if you roll a 2, it's going down, or sorry, if you roll a 1 or a 2 on a D6, which counts as a D3 1, it gets bumped up to a 2 on a D3, which means it will bring some amount of models back no matter what, which is pretty great. I actually, now that I think about it, what this is actually doing, I had read it wrong. What it's functionally doing is it could bring back up to 4 models. So it's bringing back a minimum of 2, no matter what you do, right? Because if you roll a 1 or a 2 on a D6, that counts as a D3 1. It gets converted to that. Then it gets +1 to that roll, and then goes to 2 models that it brings back. So you're bringing back no matter what 2 models. That's great. In our index review, I had said that it's bringing back at least 1, which is incorrect if I'm doing this correctly. So that means it's doing 2, 3, or 4 instead of doing 0, 2, or 3, which raises the average quite a bit. And so it's really strong. Granted, you can only do it to each unit once, so stacking this guy doesn't really make any sense, like having 2 of these guys. But if you really had enough enough Namarti units that you needed to have 2 of these guys, I could see it's basically replacing the Morphon sub-faction that we used to have without having to commit to a sub-faction, which I guess is nice. So there's some value. He's got to keep up with the Namarti. Obviously, he adds to your regiments, but of course he can take those Namarti in his regiments. He can stay alive decently long for a foot hero, especially in Idoneth. He's doing a little bit of damage. So I don't know. I think there's some value here, but I could also see just pairing him with 3 big blocks of Thralls or Reavers and just letting 1 do everything. And even if you're not in... the Isheron Council, I still think he's got some value. So in my notes, I said he's our tankiest infantry hero by a little bit. Well, by a lot, but he's still easy enough to kill, right? He's 2 health lower than the Acalian King, which has 7 health, but a 3-up save. He kind of wants to be in combat, kind of doesn't, because you don't want him to die, right? You want him to keep bringing those units back. He needs to be run with Namarti for resurrection, especially in the Isheron Council. He has a once per battle autoslay that's very situational. He's probably too expensive for what he brings at 140 points. And then I mentioned that his main weapon is doing that much damage. I give him 3 stars because I think if you're building into this build, he's essential for bringing those Namarti back, but I just don't know that it's something you're using in every list. For most lists, I'd say he's probably more like a 2-star. All right, let's move on to our last foot hero here that we're going to be covering from the index. Idoneth Thrallmaster at 130 points. He can take any Namarti, and he's also, so he can't take Lotann because he's one of the Italics heroes himself, but he can be taken as an Italics hero by the Kings, which is a weird thing because the Kings usually are trying to take more of an Eels build, an Icalian build, and he's the only Icalian unit that isn't mounted. So, it's kind of a weird thing, but at least if you kind of want to do a mixed arms thing, let's say especially you're doing the, Namarti Core, where you get a buff to reroll runs or charges to all Namarti units that are wholly than 12 of a Icalian unit. He counts as one of those Icalian units, and also by taking a King, you could put him in a King's regiment, and then you bring one of these guys, and then there's some synergy there. That said, I'd probably only really consider Volturnos for such a build because the King doesn't have any synergy with those Thralls. That said, you could do half King plus Eels and then half Volturnos with Thrallmaster and some amount of Thralls and Reavers, and maybe a Soulrender thrown in to be getting some value there. So I guess there's like a mixed arms build that kind of makes sense with him. If we look at his profile, we're back to a 5-up save. So unfortunately, even though he's definitely the best output, he's just not sticking around very easily. I wish he'd been on at least a 4-up save. That would have been cool, but it is what it is. His main weapon is 5 attacks, 3s, 4s, 1 rend, 2, which makes him the best output. And he could give himself his own ability, but I'll get that in a second. And then his Snapjaw's Vicious Bite, I never know the names of these things, is doing a 0.50 with no rend on average. Now, he's got 2 abilities here. The one on the right is kind of the standard power pair foot hero that wants to bring in a similar unit. He wants to take Thralls into combat with him, so he fights, and as long as they're within combat range of him, so 3 inches, they get to fight right afterwards, which is nice, right? So that's cool. And I definitely see some value for his output, and then guaranteeing that Thralls get to go in with him. Helps keep him alive a little bit longer, too. He's got a combat phase ability. This is the main reason you're taking the guy. Any combat phase, so even in your opponent's combat phase, you just get to pick an ability and it just goes off, which, God, I miss those days, I guess, but, it makes the game less predictable and therefore, maybe a little more fair for people. But this just goes off. He gets to benefit from this ability, and all Namarti units wholly than 12 inches get to benefit. The 2 abilities are that they give melee weapons giving crit 2 hits, which is exploding hits. If you roll a 6, then you get an extra dice to add to your wound rolls and then save rolls if they go through for your opponent. It's a good ability, but it functionally acts like +1 to hit mathematically, and interestingly enough, stacks with +1 to hit because you can't actually do +2 to hit and get any value out of it unless your opponent's debuffing you, because you can only have max 1 better on your to hit rolls than what you currently have on your war scroll. So this lets you bypass that and functionally get +2 to hit mathematically. So he could be giving that to himself, not to his companion, keep in mind, because companion attacks don't benefit from any abilities that don't explicitly say that, but he would be basically putting himself on 2s and 4s, 1 rend, 2, which is a decent profile. And then the other ability is this bubble of subtract 1 from wound rolls for attacks that target those units. Now this only lasts to the end of the turn and is triggered in the combat phase, which means it doesn't apply to shooting. But it does make your, say, big block of Reavers and this guy tankier to survive a round of combat. Or, of course, your Thralls as well. But the reason I mention those other units is because the Thralls probably want to get crit 2 hits to really push their output out, and we'll be looking at that momentarily. But this guy, is also working in a defensive role. Say you really need to keep a certain number of models alive on that objective, you all defense them, just so that you can keep your opponent from taking that objective. So that could have some really strong impacts. My notes, I said he's our fightiest infantry hero, and if we skip to the bottom, we'll see. Well, actually, let's not do that just yet. So I mentioned that he gives a holy than 12-inch bubble to himself and Namarti units for either exploding hits or -1 to wound in combat. Thralls fight immediately after him, so that's nice. Now, because of this crit thing that he could be giving himself, and let's say he's standing around the Eidolon of the Storm, which would be giving him +1 to wound, he actually gets up to 5 5/9 at -1 on his main weapon, plus the 0.50 with no rend coming from his mount or companion, which is not bad for especially Idoneth foot hero. And then if he fights first and then Thrallmaster, and by the way, I do think, or sorry, and then the Thralls, I do think you kind of want him to be around Eidolon of the Storm kind of all times for those Thralls anyway, so it's not crazy to think he'd be getting that buff as well. So it's pretty reliable, and you could even all attack him, which would be throwing him into essentially auto-hit mathematically, which I didn't account for here, but pushes his output and the Thralls, pretty far, but I think you'd probably want to save that all-out attack for the Thralls. Anyway, I gave this guy 3 stars because, just like the Soulrender, I think he really needs to be in a Thralls build. He is a Thrallmaster, after all. But I do think he's got a lot of utility. And for what it's worth, you can also give your Reavers crit 2 hits, which, they have 1 attack, 3s and 4s, no rend 1 on their melee. But if for some reason you got Volturnos around and he's giving out for 3 different units +1 attack, and you have no better target than the Reavers, weight of dice, it could be quite nice with doubling the amount of attacks that are as functionally at what equates to 2s and 4s, no rend 1. So could be something. Anyway, let's move on to the Thralls themselves. You get 10 for 120 points. They can be taken by literally all IDK heroes, which is fantastic. So they're what I call an unlimited unit, which means they can be taken by every single hero in the army. They have 6-inch move, 1 health, 5 up save, control 1. They do have a champion, so they're getting 1 extra attack from the champion, but even though it looks like a banner, it is not. So their max control score for a unit of 10. They each have 2 attacks, elf profile of 3s and 4s, 1 rend, 1 damage. They get an extra point of rend base against infantry, which is really nice to help cut through, but I kind of miss the extra attack they used to kind of implicitly get against infantry. Keep in mind, though, foot heroes are often infantry, and so are big, like Kroxigor type elite infantry, monster-looking infantry, which means that rend can actually go quite a ways. So I wouldn't poo-poo it just yet, but their output might be a little underwhelming just looking at it here. Their passive ability for sweeping blows is adding 1 to the damage characteristic of their melee weapon for attacks that target enemy monsters. Now granted, there's no overlap between monsters and infantry, so you're basically choosing between +1 damage here, or not choosing, but you either have +1 damage or you're getting +1 rend. There the two shall meet, I guess. And, of course, implicit in this discussion is that against war machines, beasts, or most notably in a cavalry, what looks like a cavalry edition, you're not getting any bonuses. So they really need to go into either infantry, the smaller targets, or the biggest targets. And that's also kind of a nerf because they used to get +1 damage on anything that had a wounds characteristic of 3 or more, if I'm not mistaken. So that's definitely been nerfed. But anyway, in the notes I said they're our closest thing to a chaff unit because they're just our cheapest points per body without what am I trying to say? Kind of having access to any kind of allies or coalition type stuff, basically Regim's Renown. They're also very glass cannony. They can put out, as we're about to see, quite a lot of damage if you buff them right, but they're at a 1 health apiece and 5 up save. You need to be attacking first. But like I say here, with the right buffs, they can also do a lot of work, especially with Strike First, which you have in Battle Round 3 implicitly. So could be a lot of good work going on. You just need to time it right. And of course, they really want to go into either infantry or monsters. So I said they want to go either infantry or monster hunting. All right, so let's head over to the damage output. So for anyone that hasn't seen one of my graphs thus far, just a quick refresher. We're looking at their output against a 6 up, 5 up, 4 up, 3 up, 2 up save, and then separated from that is the expected value average, which is just the average of what we're seeing here. And I mean, expected value is actually, by the way, another way of saying average, but I mean the average of the expected values, meaning that we're looking at the flat uniform average from a 6 up, 5 up, 4 up, 3 up, and 2 up save. And the reason why I feel like that's even more fair in 4th edition to calculate is because it's just not as common to get save stacking or even all-out defense with how kind of rare it is to get CPs these days. So that's why it's more or less comparing it to the flat average between all those values. That a 6 is occurring relatively as often as a 2, a 5 is relatively as often as a 3, and then a 4 is the most common, I suppose. So anyway, what we can see here is in blue, we're looking at the base output for a unit of 10 Thralls. If you go look over to expected value average at the end there, we're looking at just under 5 wounds. Average across all saves. If they go into infantry with an extra point of rend, that jumps up to probably 5.5-ish, which is decent, but probably not what you were expecting. But this could be our chaff unit, right? And then if you're going into monsters, because we doubled the damage, it does a lot more output. We're going up to something like 9.5-ish, 9.33 output against monsters, which is pretty great. So that's definitely something to take into account. And if you're ever curious, I never really cover on this channel what it's like to do 20 Thralls because you can just double it. But in case you wanted to see what that output would be like, it's basically the same as you could double each one of these, or you could just say for 10 against not monsters, it's roughly the same as what we're looking at for monsters, right? Because it's double damage. Now, down below, I've been including these tables that show how we compare our units to other units in the book based off of their points efficiency. So how much damage they're doing using the expected value average per 100 points. Now, I'm going to do it a little differently this time with Thralls because I wanted to compare them against their 3 different targets. So that would be against non-infantry, non-monsters, against specifically infantry, and specifically monsters. So we're going to start with the base situation, which is not infantry or monsters. They're doing 3 and 8/9 damage on average per 100 points worth of these guys. And the change column is just saying relative to themselves how much of an improvement it is. Of course, there's no improvement against themselves. Now, an Alopex, this is assuming that they have blood in the water, essentially, with +1 attack on their ferocious bite. That's a 187. And this is assuming Thralls have no buffs. They're just flat, naked Thralls, essentially. They're still, per 100 points, 50-ish% better efficiency-wise than the Alopex, which is saying something. Ishlian Guard, this is assuming they're going into infantry, and we're not assuming the Thralls are going into infantry. The Thralls are still better at 5%. Now, granted, we're comparing apples and oranges here because Thralls don't move as fast as those units. They don't have as much utility. They don't have as many wounds, all that stuff. But if you're just looking at pure damage output, they're just better, even than Ishlian Guard when Ishlian Guard are going into what they want to be going into. And then Morsar Guard, of course, are better. This is assuming they're on the charge, by the way, though. If they're not on the charge, they're roughly the same as Thralls. But Thralls are 38% worse than Morsar Guard, which is what this means in the change column. We're looking at Thralls relative to Morsar Guard, not what Morsar Guard are relative to Thralls. But still, this is assuming Thralls with absolutely no buffs. And that's assuming Morsar Guard on the charge, which is where they want to be getting their impact hits and getting +1 damage. So it's not a fair comparison. But even then, it still comes out in the not that bad for Thralls. If we go over, now we're changing over, same exact chart above, but we're the chart below, now we're looking at Thralls against infantry, and their damage per 100 points goes up to 4 2/3. You can see against an Alopex, it's now 60% better than an Alopex per 100 points. An Ishlian Guard is now 21% instead of 5%, and they're only 15% worse than Morsar Guard, again with all the same buffs assumed for all 3 of those units, which is saying something. And then let's go to if Thralls are going into monsters, 7 7/9 per 100 points is an insane output. They're 76% better than an Alopex, 52% better than Ishlian Guard, and 31% better than Morsar Guard per 100 points, even though Morsar Guard were charging and getting those impact hits, which is saying something for sure. So this is where we really have to start talking about efficiency. And even though I just said that they're sitting at a kind of a deficit in comparison to their speed and in comparison to their tankiness, I guess you could say, one thing they're not at a deficit for per 100 points, which is something we could also take into account, is how many bodies they count as on objectives. And Alopex is only counting as 2. Now, per 100 points, we'd have to divide, and it's actually less, because that's 2 for 190 points. The Ishlian are counting as 3, or 4 if you count the standard, but not per 100 points, so you divide that by 180, and then multiply by 100, of course. And then Morsar Guard, same thing. So the Thralls are definitely have an advantage in terms of bodies and objectives. It's just easier to peel them off because they're less tanky. All right, but let's move on to what everyone really wants to know is what happens when we buff Thralls to the high heavens. So this chart is only with buffs. We don't have any of the bases here. And the first chart, the one above, we're looking at with not against infantry, not against monsters, just their base profile, but with some external buffs. So +1 to hit could be with an all-out attack. It could also be with the crit 2 hits from the Thrallmaster, which goes off automatically, so it's pretty reliable as long as he's there and they're standing wholly within 12 inches of his bubble. Now, why am I calling it +1 to hit? Because mathematically it comes out to +1 to hit. It has the same impact. So I just thought I'd roll both of those into one. If we look at the expected value average there, then that's in the right column. We're looking at, and this is just on their base profile, they're shooting up to about probably 6-ish wounds. This is just a unit of 10, by the way. If we have just the Storm and no +1 to hit, Eidolon of the Storm, the +1 to wound bubble, then that's a little bit more still, but not a whole lot more. If we add +2 to hit, so as in an all-out attack plus the crit 2 hits, which functionally puts them on auto hitting because they have a base 3 to hit, then they get +1 functionally from the crit 2 to hits, and they get or let's say from the +1 to hit we get an actual +1 to hit, that puts them on 2s, and then when you add exploding hits to 2+, you're functionally getting up to 6 out of 6 attacks go through. Because if you rolled, the chance that you roll a 6 is the same as the chance that you roll a 1. So every time you roll a 6, as long as you have enough weight of dice, you're mathematically balancing out those 1s to functionally be like everything went through. And so we can see that that's the green bar, and that's going yet a little bit higher. But let's say we go all in, and you get +1 to hit, from using all-out attack, which is cost you nothing but a CP, you know it goes off. They're standing wholly within 12-inch bubble of the Storm, so they're getting +1 to wound, and they're also standing wholly within 12-inch bubble of the Thrallmaster to put them up to basically auto hits, functionally. That is the light blue bar, and now we're looking at something like a 9.5 damage output, and this is assuming they're on base. And then let's take in the once per game ability from Volturnos, where he can pick 3 different other IDK units and give them +1 attack, which increases their output by 50%. So that last one is basically all the buffs plus the Volturnos buff in whichever turn you might want, and that's pushing them all the way up to something around 14 wounds just for that unit of 10 Thralls. And remember that the other units, like let's say you had another block of 10 Thralls, they could be getting all these buffs except for all-out attack. But, of course, if you doubled it by having a unit of 20, then you're going up to, you could do all those buffs, and then we're sitting at something like 28 damage. But that leads us to our next conversation, which is the chart below. I'm not going to go through each one separately. It's the exact same things, but this is when they're going into a monster. And you notice it looks kind of the same, but that's because the scale changed. The scale in the chart above was from 0 to 25. Now the scale goes from 0 to 45. And so what we're seeing is expected value average when you're getting all those buffs off against a monster. That one unit of 10 Thralls is doing around 27 wounds worth. That's amazing. Even if you don't use the the once per battle Volturnos ability, the purple one, you can do the light blue one. You all attack them, you have all the other buffs going on. Then we're looking at around, I don't know, 19, 18.5-ish wounds against a monster, which is on average killing it. And then this is just a unit of 10 Thralls, so you would double that if you had a big block of 20. They can do a crazy amount of work with mostly buffs that are reliable and don't require rolling anything fancy. It's just weight of dice and getting a fantastic set of filter steps with a basically auto hit, wound rolls on 3s essentially, -1 rend, or 1 rend, and then 2 damage against monsters, or however you want to look at it. It's doing a lot of work. Now, why did I only give Thralls 3 stars? Just like I did with the Soulrender and the Akkalian Thrallmaster, they're really only pulling out that work if they are getting a certain build. And I think they're a great unit. They're cheap. They could be chaff, although they're just not that mobile. Yes, in round 2 they can run and charge, run and shoot, but I just don't know that they're doing as much work in a list that's not built to fine-tune for them. So I'd think twice about taking them as just chaff, because Idoneth is just fine with an Eels build, flying around and staying out of engagements until it's time to really go in for the kill. Anyway, but that's why I give them 3 stars. All right, moving on to Reavers. We can cover this a little faster. Their melee output is not worth talking about, and I already basically did, with 1 attack, 3s, 4s, no rend 1. Again, with Volturnos' ability, that would double for that 1 turn where they get +1 attack, but again, not really much of anything to talk about. The main highlight of this War Scroll is the 7-inch move combined with the fact that it can run and or retreat. Well, not and or. It can either run or retreat and then shoot. Worth noting is that it does still take the D3 mortal damage if it retreats, except in Ebb Tide, which is the 4th battle round, because then they get the better wording from the whole army. But running and shooting, especially if you have a big block of 20 and you want to auto-run them, is putting them at 13-inch movement plus a 12-inch threat range, putting them at 25. It's worth pointing out, you might be thinking, well, the Tidecaster has a way to do +1 to run, so I could auto-run them for 6 and then get +1, but that's not how that works. The +1 is to run rolls, and auto-running forward to victory, I guess it is, or maybe it's at the double. It might be at the double. In any case, I always forget which one's which. It says it bypasses the whole run rolls thing, so you're not actually rolling something that could have values added. So it's just a flat 6. It can't be modified, basically. So if you really wanted to get that 26-inch threat range, you would have to risk rolling a 6, and then you'd get the +1 to jump it up to 7. But usually I don't think it's worth it. I would just go with an auto run if you're debating. But if you don't want to blow CP, then of course the +1 to run is great. So it's putting you on an average 4.5-inch run roll instead of a 3.5, which is the average on a D6. Now, their shooting profile is only 12-inch range, like I said. 2 attacks, 3s, 4s, -1 rend or 1 rend, 1 damage, and crit auto wounds, which means if they roll a 6, they are skipping the whole wound step. Now, if you have, fun fact, if you have a wound roll of a wound value, 2 wound value of 4+, then crit auto wound is mathematically the same thing as +1 to hit. So you can think of it mathematically as the same thing as 2s and 4s, -1 rend, 1 damage. Now, if the to wound roll, as it gets worse, so like it goes to a 5-up or a 6-up, then it becomes better than a +1 to hit. And as it gets better, it goes to a 3-up or a 2-up, it gets worse than +1 to hit. So just so you know, 4-up is mathematically the same thing as +1 to hit. Now, this is a unit that you might want to give priority target to in your general's regiment, especially if you take a big block of 20, so that you get more shots that are getting that +1 to hit and +1 to wound against a unit that's in your opponent's general's regiment, and at least the general, of course. And then they be getting +1 to hit and +1 to wound, which pushes their output even higher, of course. And then, of course, that's also negating the covering fire restriction, which the -1, not restriction, but debuff of -1 for covering fire, which I'll cover momentarily. But anyway, so let's talk about the unit. You're getting 10 of them for 130 points, so they could also be chaff, and in a certain sense, they might be way better as a throwaway chaff unit than Thralls because they can run and shoot, which means they can run and still do something every single turn. That also makes them fast, in a sense, to go be, if you don't have Eels, go put them on the sides to go take the flanks or go take some objectives and then come back. They don't have a standard bearer, but still pretty good. And like, Thralls, they can be taken by all IDK heroes, so they can fit into almost any list. So in my notes, I said they have incredible flexibility as either heavy ranged output, especially in blocks of 20 with priority target, or as objective grabbers. Or screens. They have run and retreat and or shoot or whatever. Run and then either retreat or shoot is amazing. If someone does charge in and you know that you're going to take more than D3 damage worth of losses, you might as well retreat and then you can still shoot. Maybe go grab an objective. You're outside of combat. You're free to shoot again next turn instead of sitting in a rough place. Well, if you double turn or whatever. You're free to move around. You don't have to be scared of that unit unless, of course, they blow 2 CP to countercharge into you. You could... I don't know if you could... At the moment, you can use Covering Fire because it doesn't check for whether you used... it doesn't follow the normal rules of shooting abilities, but that might change in a coming battle scroll because it just says Resolve Shooting Attacks. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And, of course, in Battle Round 4, you can retreat, shoot, and charge back in if you want. I said they're especially good in 20s as a priority target, and they also work in 10s for flanks and or for Soul Raid ambushers, which I will admit is a little more difficult with a block of 20 because getting all 20 of them wholly within 3 inches of a terrain feature is tough. But a lot of times in the game, they get pulled, they get shot to death or combated down to a small enough unit. And remember, with Battle Shotgun, you're not losing the whole unit automatically. So there are plenty of situations where you might get down to 5 units out of the 20 that still have the priority target. You get out of combat, you rally them a bit, you teleport them to safety, whatever you got to do. Maybe you can get back up to 10 or 15 or so models, and then they're still doing what they were meant to do, and you've pulled them away. Another trick is to teleport, like I said, the Soulscryer with Soul Raid Ambushers, or even in any other faction, just as long as you got to teleport. Have another hero teleport the Soulscryer to the place you want him to be, have them deep strike in, then, and of course, implicitly, they're wholly within 12 inches. They shoot, right? And then in the following turn, your opponent can, or you can magical intervention from that Soulscryer, and then have him... I guess he could have done his own teleport in the previous turn as well, because the magical intervention, of course, is in a different turn. But then in any case, he can teleport this unit back to safety, which is pretty amazing. And he can also teleport them out of combat, by the way, so that's also good, which could teleport that big block wholly within 3 inches of a terrain feature, like inside of woods, and then they're implicitly wholly within 3. So pretty nice. Let's take a look at their output. For a block of 10, I did 4 different scenarios here. Their base is actually orange, which is not my usual MO here. The base is actually orange, so let's take a look at that first. A unit of 10 of them, expected value average is doing just under 5 damage, so probably 5 2/3 or so. Now, the Covering Fire base, so this is with a -1 to hit. I just thought I'd put it in there because this unit probably wants to be using Covering Fire. That's making them a little worse, which is putting them around 4.5, maybe 4 2/3 against all saves. Then, if you look at the light blue, we're looking at priority target. They're a unit of 10, and even just 10 at priority target is somewhere around 8.5, which is pretty decent considering you're probably taking a unit of 20, which more or less doubles it, excluding the extra attack you get for the champion. So then you're looking at something like, I don't know, 17, which is pretty good. And then even Covering Fire against with a priority target is putting them down to like, I guess that's about 7. And then, of course, if you have a block of 20, we're looking at around 14. Not bad. So in the damage comparison here, we've got some Reavers. Damage per 100 point is sitting around 4.5. And then if you're comparing them to a Leviathan, who just per 100 points is not really a great shooting unit. This is without buffing any of these units. They're at 80% better than the Leviathan per 100 points efficiency, and then Alopex is a little bit better than the Leviathan, but they're 74% better than an Alopex. So clearly, if you want to go shooting, you go with Reavers, and you figure out one of these techie ways to use them. I gave them 5 stars because I think they've got some utility as objective grabbers, as flank grabbers, as chaff. They're not much more expensive than Thralls, and they don't require nearly the amount of buffing that Thralls do to be meaningful. I would probably not put them in my General's Regiment if I was only taking them as a block of 10 because they're too easy to kill. But with all of the movement shenanigans, teleport shenanigans we have, it's pretty easy to keep them alive. So I very much rate this unit, at least taking 1 and maybe even a block of 20, and a lot of different builds. So I would consider it. And on to our bonus. You maybe saw this coming, maybe you didn't, but we have 1 extra Idoneth unit that does not get talked about because they have changed the way that allies work entirely, and this was always like a weird thorn in my nerdy side when I saw that Lorai had the Idoneth Deepkin keyword, but was like only used as like a regiment or whatever, maybe a regiment of renown before, but in any case, an ally, but you couldn't mix and match. And it was like, why do you have this keyword? I don't understand what's going on. Well, now they've basically fixed it. So what happens is you've got this regiment of renown, which would be your only ally you can bring, which is the Black Talons, which is Neve and her 3 companions, and then Lorai. And Lorai was always this weird, like, why is this Idoneth Deepkin unit in this Stormcast? You can see that it doesn't even have the Stormcast keyword. Why is it considered part of Stormcast? You do get to bring her, by the way. She has to come along if you take the Black Talons inside Stormcast itself. But then it's just got this Idoneth keyword doing nothing. It's a real weird thing, but it has to do with the storytelling that they have in the army, or in like the lore for the Black Talons. So, okay, cool, fine. What is Lorai bringing in and of herself? Lorai has 5 wounds, a 4-up save, which is better than usual, 6-up move, control 2, so more or less what we usually see. But she's got a 5-up ward, which is really nice because the Isheron heroes, Lotann and everyone, used to have a ward back in the day, and now this unit actually still does, which is really nice for keeping her alive. Further keeping her alive, in addition to the +1 save and 5-up ward, is this passive ability, Aquatic Illusions, which is subtracting 1 from hit rolls for attacks that target this unit, which is basically Ebb Tide that's permanently with her. And that's including combat attacks, even if she charges, which of course she probably doesn't want to, but even if. Pretty good. So this unit's always -1 to hit. Fantastic. Then she also has a spell that I would argue you probably don't want to cast, but if you're an Idoneth. But until the start of your next turn, while a friendly, the Black Talons unit is wholly within 6 inches of the unit, if the unmodified hit roll for a shooting attack that targets this unit is 1 to 5, the attack fails and the attack sequence ends. What does that mean? Well, we have 2 different Black Talons units. Actually, she's a Black Talons unit as well. She counts for herself. It doesn't say friendly other Black Talons unit, so she's automatically getting this. Basically means if you need to keep her alive, you need to keep a wizard around to have access to the spell lore, which, by the way, they said if they have the right keywords as allies, they get to use your stuff. She has the Idoneth keyword, so she gets to use the teleport spell and the other 2. It's pretty amazing. Granted, she doesn't count as Isheron, which is weird, but that's fine. I'll take it. She's -1 to hit at all times, and then shooting attacks, if this spell goes off, is making sure that they basically have to crit in order to even hit you, which is pretty great. So you're not going to get sniped. And combine this with the Isheron ritual from the Tidecaster, and you can say goodbye to being shot off the table, at least for this unit, and then Black Talon stuff. That said, I'd probably rather just save her, keep her focusing on doing the teleport, being another teleport platform. She has 3 attacks at 3s, 4s, 2 damage, which means, again, it's the same kind of profile we expect of these Isheron-type heroes. So why are you taking this, though? So she has to be in this Regiment of Renown. It costs 350 in Stormcast, but only 320 as a Regiment of Renown if you take them outside of Stormcast. So you're saving 30 points, and you get a bit extra ability that they don't get in Stormcast, where Neve gets to, once per game, fight twice, as long as the first time she fights is against a hero. So pretty amazing, because you'll see momentarily that Neve's output is insane. So why are you taking this? Well, 320 points might seem like kind of a sink, but keep in mind you're getting a caster. Like for 350, you'd be getting the the Eidolon of the Sea. So instead, you're getting a 1 caster that doesn't have a casting bonus, but wouldn't get it around Lotann either. So that's unfortunate. But you're getting a huge melee toolkit with the Black Talons and even some teleporting, which, I'll cover in a different video some other time, but there is some value, okay? Now, as I said in the notes here, you get to know the Idoneth spells as well. Unfortunately, not Isheron for the +1 to cast from either the Isheron Council or Lotann. She's expensive considering you have to bring the regiment, but we benefit more than others bringing that regiment, and Neve is fantastic, and she's relatively tanky and a beautiful model. Now, I want to talk about this output, though, because here we go. Let's look at the top first. The Black Talon's ranged output, that's just going to be Neve's 3 shots and then 3 shots from one of the 3 Neve's companions. It's doing a little bit of damage. This is base is doing around 2.5 expected value average, and then if you are against a hero, it jumps up to about 3. Okay, fine. That's not really why you're taking her. But look down at the melee, and I don't mean her, I mean the unit. Look down at that melee output. Your eyes are not tricking you. The range of possible values here for a 6-up save does in fact get up to about 37 wounds. Now, we got to explain it real quick. Now, this is the whole unit. It's the Lori, so the Idoneth model, plus the 3 companions, plus Neve, okay? Now, base is just the blue, so you're looking at expected value average for that unit. You're doing around 14 wounds, maybe 14 and a half. Expected value average if they all get to fight, which is actually saying something. And they all have a 5-up ward, basically, if they're standing near each other. And Neve can teleport on a 3-up after fighting to come back to the other unit if she needs to, which is great. So that's just assuming there's no extra buffs going on and they all get to fight. And Neve is the vast majority. She's more than half of that output, if I'm not mistaken. That's fantastic, and that's against all saves. So if you compare that for 320 points against what you'd be bringing, like the Eidolon Storm doesn't have that kind of output, I'll tell you right now. It's just not what you're seeing, and that's requiring no outside buffs. Then, versus a hero, because Neve does extra damage against a hero, and then, yeah, the other units don't, but for the shooting attack, yes. Then it jumps up to something like, what are we looking at here? About 17 and a half. Which is pretty good, and that's not requiring any outside buffs. Amazing. But in the Regiment of Renown, once per battle versus a hero, Neve gets to fight twice, and that first time needs to be against a hero, but then the second time could be against any other unit that she's also in combat with. And I think you can pair that with the teleport that might go off in a 3-up, though it might put her outside of 3 of combat. I'd have to look it up. But in any case, let's say she was around 2 units, one's a hero and one's not, or the second one could be a hero as well, then we're looking at, or actually it would have to be for this equation, by the way, it'd have to be 2 heroes. It would be a little less than this otherwise. But in any case, we're looking at that unit against all saves averaged out around 28 damage, which is insane. And that's once per battle, but keep in mind you could keep fighting on the normal profile against heroes or just regular units with this unit. Plus you've got a Idoneth caster coming along for the ride. And all of them have a great ward if they are standing near each other or, just doing their thing. So I actually think this is a great addition to an Idoneth list, especially if you want to get a little creative and you feel like you've got some points to spend. That said, points are a little hard to come by these days, but at the same time, I think it's a very flavorful way to dip into allies without feeling like you broke the bank and or that you ended up sacrificing some synergies. There's a lot of shenanigans here, especially considering Neve can teleport. There's some cool stuff that could be going on. So anyway, that's my conclusion. I gave Lori a 3 stars just because you'd have to build around it. Definitely not 2 stars. And I wouldn't put it 4. You just got to make sure you get Neve in and are really letting her go to town. Okay, so that's it, guys. This was the longest video because it had a lot of tech in it, even though we didn't cover a whole lot of melee output or just output in general. We're done with the series. We covered literally every Idoneth model that's in the game, so that's not Legends. For those of you at home that really like Legends units, I think we've seen a couple comments about them. I think we'd be happy to cover it as a little bonus video here or there, but we're more focused on the things that you can play against not only people at tournaments, but also against your friends that are trying to prepare for the game as it's meant to be, not with Legends. Because remember, the Legends might be relatively well balanced with points and with their war scrolls at this exact moment. But the further we go in time without continued support from GW where they're reevaluating those points and reevaluating their war scrolls, they either become worse, which of course hurts no one if you take it. It's just kind of a pet project then at that point. Or they might actually get better over time for some niche-y corner cases, and then GW's not balancing them, and that can be kind of detrimental. So that's why we don't cover them as much. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this series. I know we're not reaching as many people as possible, but we're going to be moving back to Lumineth shortly, briefly for the Riverblades coverage, and then on to Siege. So let us know down below, guys, what you found the most interesting, in these videos, but also what you'd like to see us cover in the not too distant future. Anyway, thanks so much. And until the next time, guys, Ryan out.